right, welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are ready to proceed. Everyone have a seat. You may continue.
Dr. Downs, previously we discussed manual strangulation. What is manual strangulation?
Basically, it's a type of asphyxia. It's using the hands or arm to compress the vasculature of the neck, and basically that causes low oxygen in the blood. That low oxygen in the blood causes death.
Would you agree that manual strangulation is mechanically easier to be done with two hands than one?
I don't really know that anybody could say that. It's simply a matter of applying force.
Okay.
I could see that being done with one or two pretty simply either way.
Did you consider the possibility that her body was rubbing up on the rocks and that there was significant amount of artifact on the front side of her body when you opined that the genital injuries were in fact consistent with blunt force penetrating trauma? Yes,
I certainly considered that the injuries to the genital area are different from the other injuries.
When you're looking at the injuries, specifically in this case, do you look at each individually in a vacuum or separate and apart from the other injuries, or do you look at them in totality?
I'd say I probably do both, but ultimately good forensic pathology is taking all the information, whatever that source is, putting it all together. But I certainly would look at an injury in isolation and see what I think of that, and then I place it in context. For instance, the genital injuries. I look at the context of the location, the physical location, what the injuries look like. So I'm looking at that. But then I have to step back and say, oh, but there are all these other injuries on her abdomen, on the front of her chest, on her face. Could this genital injury be an artifact like all this other stuff? But then I step back and I look and I say, well, let me look at the rest of the body. What does the rest of her body look like? Well, you've got areas that are protected that have no injury from barnacles, oysters, rocks, whatever it is. The genital area has blood associated with it. The genital injury has depth. So it actually goes into the body. It's not an abrasion. The genital area was submerged. We know that that causes blood to leak out. So whatever blood was there, there would be less because of the leaking of the blood into the water. So I look at that. I then step back. I look at, okay, the body is disposed of in the water. I step back. The body's nude. I consider all of this information. I don't look at just things in isolation. I look at everything that I can get and consider it.
The fact that the body was found nude, is that indicative of any way that the genital injuries, or confirm for you that the genital injuries are consistent with this being a sexual homicide?
It's certainly consistent with it. It doesn't prove anything, but certainly a body can be undressed after death, just like a body can be dressed after death. I've seen sexual homicides both ways. The body being disposed of in water, again, I've seen a lot of different types of disposal methods.
Do victims of sexual assault, and including children, typically have genital injuries?
You used a legal term that I try not to use because medically, assault is a legal term. It's not a medical term. So I try to avoid saying things like that. So sexually related injury or sexual homicide.
Yes, forgive me. So sexual, typically, do you see injury in sexual related homicides?
Oftentimes you don't. Victims are reported to only have injuries in about a third of cases where there's documented against their will sexual penetration, if you will. So it's, you don't see it all the time. It's not, oftentimes not there. It's only a minority. And when you do see it, it adds credence or adds support to this is a real injury, and since I can't speak to somebody's intent, instead I speak to what I see, most folks don't want to have injuries in that area.
Are you finding consistent with sexual homicide?
Yes.
Other than the injuries we discussed, were there any injuries to her internal organs such as the liver, spleen, lungs, anything?
I don't recall anything. There were some other findings that are nonspecific, pulmonary edema or fluid in the lungs, I believe was mentioned, as well as congestion of the lungs. Those are nonspecific injury-associated findings. They don't prove anything by themselves. They're consistent with strangulation, but they don't prove strangulation by themselves. A lot of different things can cause that exact same picture.
When an autopsy is conducted, is also toxicology screening performed on the person that is undergoing the autopsy?
Oftentimes is, sometimes it's not. It was in this case.
Was there anything of note found in her blood, in her
No.
system? I'm going to approach with what's been pre-marked as State's Exhibit KB 1 through 32. Are these photographs all the photographs pulled specifically from your PowerPoint?
I would have to go through my PowerPoint picture by picture
Okay.
to verify that these were in fact. Do I need to do that?
Yes.
Okay.
I have your PowerPoint right here, so I'll assist you.
Okay. Thank you.
Did you give them all back to me?
Sorry. I was trying to make good use of the time. My apologies.
You recognize that one as being in your PowerPoint?
I do.
Okay. Move to the next one.
Yeah, but there's more on that one. Yes, those three. Yes. Yes. That's one. Yes. 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 And yes. 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 Yes and yes. 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 Yes, and yes. Yes. Yes.
And the blown up one has already been admitted as KA1. So those photographs are going to accurately depict the photographs contained within your PowerPoint,
Yes.
and that's KB1 through 32.
So you did make them?
Dr. Yes, Judge. State officer notice State's Exhibit KB1 through 32.
Any objection?
None other than previously discussed.
Admitted.
Dr. Downs, you previously testified that you reviewed all the autopsy photographs in this case, correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to show you what's been pre-marked for identification purposes. K56, K55, K57, K58, K3, K4, K18, K19, K23, K64, K63, K62, K48, and K77. Do you recognize those photographs?
Yes, ma'am.
Do they fairly and accurately depict the photographs that you reviewed
Yes,
on the
ma'am.
autopsy disc that you received in this case?
Yes, ma'am. I don't know if you meant to leave that
I apologize.
here or not.
The state would offer into evidence, Judge, those particular K exhibits.
Renew all previous objections.
Right.
Okay, same ruling by the court, they will be admitted.
Doctor, if you can look at the screen behind you. Permission to publish, Judge?
Yes.
K56. Can you explain what we were looking at here? What part of Miss Williams' body?
This appears to be her neck on the front. The artifactual injuries that we discussed earlier, the paler areas going all across the front of her chest, lesser injuries on the left shoulder, and the area of her chin and jaw.
Does this document or show that, in fact, that you did not see any ligature marks?
That's correct. The area that I would be looking would be, as I'm indicating, you can kind of see lines here. Those are just creases in her neck. Normal finding, but there's no marking there that would be suggestive of ligature mark at all.
Publishing K55. Again, is this a photograph depicting the right side of her neck?
Right side of her neck and face.
And all the injuries that we discussed are contained underneath her skin, within her neck, correct?
That's correct. There's nothing here that I can look at and tell you anything about what happened to her. There's nothing here that I can say, well, this indicates she's been strangled. I don't see anything. I just see the artifacts that we talked about.
States K57. Again, is this the right portion, part of the back of her neck, closer to the sternum area?
Well, you can see the sternum up in the top center of the picture. This is the right side of her neck. So the windpipe would be roughly where I'm indicating here, below where the chin joins the neck. And again, I don't see any external findings there of note at all.
And do you typically see external findings with manual strangulation?
Oftentimes do. In children, oftentimes we don't. And we may not see them in adults. It really just depends on the circumstances of the case and how the interaction went down.
States Exhibit K8. Is this depicting the left side of her neck?
That's correct.
States Exhibit K3. In your PowerPoint, we didn't see the lower half of her body. Are these marks on her thighs and her knee and part of her upper shin area consistent with being as artifact?
Yes, all of these are artifact. Just to not extend the PowerPoint is the only reason I didn't include this. The point was made with the one slide that I used, but this is the same type of injury, just in a different location.
State's Exhibit K18, is this the right arm and showing the armpit area of Miss Williams?
Yes, it is.
Can you explain how, is it consistent or fair to say that the armpit area was a protected area from the rocks and the location that her body was in?
Well, it was relatively protected. If you remember the right arm in particular, and maybe you could go back to that very first picture, the one, the scene picture.
And this will be State's Exhibit KB1.
So again, she's face down. So she's laying in the water like this. Her right arm coming across here. And as I said, it's not anchoring her, but stabilizing. And you can see the arm is away from the body. But even with that, that armpit area is still protected. It's a recessed area. And it's an area where you have a whole lot of injuries to the right shoulder. Not as much as the left, but that's an area with a lot of injuries. Yet the armpit, because it's in a recessed, protected area, there's no injuries in there.
K19, is this a photograph of the right side of her body?
Yes, it is.
And was mainly the artifact contained on the victim in this case to the front of her body?
Yes, it was.
State's Exhibit K23, is this depict the left side of her body?
It does.
State's 64A, or K64, was mainly the back of her body absent of artifact.
Yes, ma'am.
And what does that tell you?
That area wasn't exposed to the rocks, barnacles, etc., like the front of her body was.
K63, again, is that just continuing to show her upper part of her back?
Yes, down to her, looks like right above her buttocks.
And K62, is that the lower part of her body on her back?
It is.
K48, does this photograph depict the genitalia of the victim?
It does.
And can you explain how protected that area where we ultimately saw injury was?
As you can see, since you can actually see the vaginal area, the vaginal opening, the legs have to be spread to take the photograph to show this area. But even with the legs spread, the buttocks are coming together and the area of the vaginal opening is recessed within the labia, the lips of the vagina. So it is protected not only because it's deeper in the body, it's protected by the vaginal lips as well as the flesh forward of that. In addition, most of the trauma's to the front of the body. This area is not in the front, it's actually kind of rounded and at the bottom of the body, if that makes sense. It's not at the front or in the back, it's between those two.
Was there any injury noted to the victim's anus?
No, there was no injury. There was dilation. That's a common post-mortem artifact, not an injury.
K77. Does this photograph depict the genitalia as well as her anus?
It does.
Doctor, you can have a seat. Doctor, do you have an opinion as to the time of death of Miss Williams?
It's consistent with the time interval that's been suggested to me. The only thing you can say with certainty is it happened between the time she was last seen and when she was first found. There's not a lot of decompositional change here. If you remember early on, we were talking about a blood vessel, and I said I didn't see any leaking of blood out of that vessel as an artifact. That's a decomposition artifact. I don't see that, so I would favor, certainly not a day's period, but it's not like TV. I can't be, 11.3 hours or something like that.
Does water, the fact that the body was in the water, affect the ability to ascertain the time of death or opine with regards to that?
It does, because now you're entering in things like water temperature, and water has different temperatures depending on where the body is in the water. If a body goes down, it's colder at the bottom this time of year, colder at the bottom than at the top, certainly in the ocean. So if the body goes down, it's going to end up in a colder environment, refrigerating, slowing down postmortem change. You also have complicating factors like crabs, fish, shrimp, all of that aquatic life that can alter things like the area around the eye. So it's imprecise. I would not feel comfortable telling you a specific hour interval.
Are pathologists typically able to say the death occurred at 5 p.m. on this date?
Only on TV.
Okay. Are your findings consistent with her death occurring at approximately 5 p.m., being placed into the water at approximately 11:30 p.m., and being found the next day at around 3 p.m.?
Yes.
Judge, may we have a moment?
Yes.
Dr. Downs, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the victim in this case was alive or dead when she was placed in the water?
I don't have any indication that she was alive. I can't completely dismiss that. But based on everything that I see, I believe she was dead when she was placed in the water.
Are all of the inflicted pre-mortem or pre-death injuries consistent with having been occurred at or around the time of her death?
They are.
Do you have an opinion as to the amount of time it would take a person to inflict all of those injuries that we have been discussing all afternoon?
They could certainly happen within a matter of minutes. We discussed the strangulation to the point of unconsciousness, continuing that grip for another couple of minutes. Add to that a couple of blows to the head, the forceful gripping or whatever it is that caused the bruising of the shoulders, the bruising to the back. That could all have happened in the order of minutes. The genital, it doesn't take long to have one thrust and you have that injury. So all told, it could have been maybe 5 minutes. Could be longer than that.
Minutes as a minimum. 5 minutes as a minimum.
And again, don't hold me to the 5 minutes. If you said 4 minutes, 30 seconds, I'd say sure, why not? But a ballpark, that's an estimate.
Are your findings consistent with a 9-year-old being attacked, raped, strangled?
Again, you used a term that I don't use. Forced sexual penetration, yes, and would be consistent with this manual strangulation as well, and attack.
Within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what is the cause of death of Felicia Williams?
Asked and answered.
Sustain the objection.
Within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what is the manner of death for Felicia
Asked and
Williams?
answered.
Well, actually, I don't know if it's been asked within a reasonable degree of medical certainty. So go ahead, you can answer.
Manner of death is homicide.
No further questions, Judge.
Okay, Cross?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'll be brief. You indicated that your findings are consistent with the time of death being 5 p.m. and the body being deposited into the water between 11 and 12:30.
I was asked if that was consistent, and it is.
Yes. And would it also be consistent with the time of death being 6 p.m. with the same schedule?
Sure. Again, it's not like TV. The only real accurate way is a witness with a watch.
Same with 7 p.m.?
Yes.
No other questions?
Redirect.
Nothing, Judge.
All right, may this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, very good. You're free to go.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, state who's your next witness.
State would briefly recall Detective Elmer.
Detective Elmer, come on in. Hello, you remain under oath. When you were previously sworn, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Detective, when you had collected originally the soil and placed it in the baggies, the items of evidence that we reviewed yesterday, did you also document the photographs of that area in the vehicle that you collected?
Yes.
The soil from? I'm approaching you and showing you what's been pre-marked as States Exhibit 1 through 7, HH 1 through 7. Do these photos fairly and accurately depict the area within the passenger side of the vehicle where you collected the soil?
Yes.
State offers an evidence, States Exhibit 1 through 7, HH.
Any objections?
No, Your Honor.
Admitted?
Permission to publish?
Yes.
Detective, behind you on the screen, I'm showing publishing States Exhibit HH1. Is this the Lexus SUV vehicle or Lexus vehicle that you ultimately collected the soil from?
Yes.
And that was from the passenger side, is that correct?
Correct.
The front and back of the passenger side?
Correct.
States Exhibit 3HH. Can you point to the area in which that you ultimately collected soil from?
Do not believe you can see it in that photo. It's the actual floorboard.
States Exhibit 4HH. Is this a far away photograph of the front passenger seat?
Yes. You would have been exhibit out here.
States HH5. Is that a close-up of that area?
Correct.
And State 7HH. Is that the back seat compartment of the area that you collected the soil from?
It's tough for me to tell from that photo.
But you did, in fact, collect soil from
Yes.
the front portion and from the back portion.
Correct.
And was it documented on the baggies
Correct.
that you then sealed that soil in?
Yes.
State has no further questions, Judge.
Okay, Cross?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. May this witness be excused again?
Yes, Judge.
Okay. Reading
Thank you.
no subject to being recalled. All right, state who's your next witness?
State would call Dr. Randall Alexander.
Stop here first, state the clerk, for the swearing in.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give in this cause is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I did. You step up this way, Doctor. Sure. See the witness stand.
Good afternoon, Dr. Alexander.
Hi,
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
I'm Randall Alexander. I'm a child abuse pediatrician. I'm the chief of the Division of Child Protection and Forensic Pediatrics at the University of Florida in Jacksonville. We have College of Medicine branches in both Gainesville and in Jacksonville.
Can you describe what your duties are with regards to being a chief of the Division of the Child Protection and Forensic Pediatrics?
Sure. I have administrative duties. We have about 13 grants that help fund what we do, grants and contracts, and I'm the administrator for a tiny percentage on about half of those. About 25% of my time is working with Wolfson Children's Hospital on child abuse prevention activities of various sorts. I'm also the fellowship director. Fellows are doctors who are getting training beyond their residencies, and I'm the program director for 2 fellows, and that's for child abuse pediatrics, so that when they're done, if they finish the fellowship and pass the national test, they can be board certified as child abuse pediatricians. I also see kids, and I see kids both in Jacksonville, and my team covers 8 counties from Georgia down through Daytona, and so I take weekend call both in Jacksonville and just recently I did my weekend call down in Daytona, and there I see kids for various kinds of child abuse. I also do the death review reports for the child protection team, where I look at all the autopsy things and law enforcement and school, certainly emergency medicine, all the other sorts of things that go into a given case, and write a report about that. And I do that for all the cases in which there may or may not be child maltreatment in those 8 counties.
Approximately how many death fatality review cases do you do a year?
Probably about 80.
And that is mainly within the area of where you are employed within Jacksonville and the surrounding counties?
Right, those 8 counties.
Can you give us a brief educational background?
Sure. I went to Michigan State University, 1968, got my bachelor's degree in psychology in 1972. Then I went down the road to the University of Michigan, and I got a master's degree in 1974 in psychology. Did a couple more years, but then went to Wayne State University in Detroit Medical School, and I got my MD degree in 1980. And then I did a 3-year standard pediatric residency in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is Michigan State's largest clinical campus. And then I did an additional year, being a combination of a chief resident and what we call a fellow in community pediatrics, where I worked on child abuse issues. And then I was able to finish up my PhD, which I kind of had on hold when I was in medical school and regular residency. So I got my PhD in experimental psychology as well.
Now, are you a board certified pediatrician?
I am.
Do you hold a licensure in the state of Florida?
I do that as well.
And are you board certified in any specialty area?
I am. There's a specialty called child abuse pediatrics. It's a national specialty. It's like there's pediatric cardiology, pediatric pulmonary. There's a thing called child abuse pediatrics. It's been around now for 10 years. And in 2009, I was in the group that first became certified in that subspecialty.
Prior to becoming the chief of the Division of Child Protection and Forensic Pediatrics, first of all, how long have you been employed there?
A little over 15 years.
Where did you work prior to that?
Before that, I was in Morehouse School of Medicine for 6 years in Atlanta. And then before that, I was at the University of Iowa for 14 years.
All during those times examining children?
Yeah. When you're, I work with colleges or university. I've always worked there. But when you're a physician, you're seeing kids or adults, whoever it is your age group is. But you're seeing them all along. You're clinically involved. We're not teaching students like a college professor in an undergraduate course or something. We're clinically active. And a lot of our teaching is by having people work with us as we see patients.
And are you, have you previously been the statewide medical director for the Florida Child Protection Teams?
I have. I was statewide medical director for all of the child protection teams, the 23 teams or so in the state, for 10 years.
Can you explain what the what a child protection team is?
Sure. So we're unique here in Florida. We have some stuff in state law. It's Chapter 39.303. And in that law, it establishes the child protection team. And the child protection teams are funded by the state of Florida. We actually are funded through the Department of Health. And they then create what's essentially a public-private partnership with these 23 now different teams. And so the team that's, say, here in Tampa is University of South Florida, holds the contract to provide those services here in this county. But if you're in Pinellas, it's a social service agency that holds the contract. So there are 5 teams that are under the universities of one sort or another. In my case, it's in Jacksonville. We're actually the largest team in the state in terms of volume. And we're through the University of Florida in Jacksonville. Gainesville has a team. Miami has a team. They're medically directed. The purpose of us is to do medical examination, forensic interviews, a variety of other services to try to sort of figure out what's going on. And as the language says, it's to assist the Department of Children and Family and others in terms of helping them with their investigations. So we see cases where someone thinks it might be child abuse, but it's not, and sometimes it is.
And is it just child abuse, or is also held under that umbrella sexual abuse? Is sexual abuse held under the umbrella of child abuse?
Yeah, so child abuse, when you say that, means everything. So I know sometimes people say child abuse and they mean physical abuse, but technically physical abuse is just one of the categories. So child abuse could be sexual abuse, it could be physical abuse, it could be neglect, psychological maltreatment of various sorts. And by law, we cover all of those things.
And as far as the child protection team, for example, will someone that's employed with the Department of Children and Families or law enforcement who believes that a child may be a victim of a child abuse, bring them to the child protection team to be examined by an advanced registered nurse practitioner or a physician?
Right.
Okay. You also mentioned that child protection teams assist in the forensic interviews. Are those usually another aspect? If a child goes there for an exam, they will also go through a forensic interview with a qualified person who actually interviews a child?
Yeah, we primarily do forensic interviews in sexual abuse cases. And that's a very specialized way of video recording what it is you're doing. So the court or someone else can look at it and see what the child said at that particular time. And there are certain ways in which you ask questions and don't ask questions. And so we do that in most of the child protection teams around the state.
And when you served as director, so you were the head of all of these various child protection teams around the state of Florida. Is that fair to say?
Yes, they each have a medical director, and then I was the boss of all the medical directors.
Okay. And do you still work with the child protection team?
I do. I'm the person that holds the contract. My division holds the contract, and in turn, I supervise academically the medical director that's in my area. Actually, 2 of them, because we have Daytona as well. And then as I said, clinically, I see kids too.
How many physical child abuse exams have you conducted?
Maybe a couple thousand, 1,000, something like that. I don't know. I don't keep score, but I've lots of them through the years. I mean, I've been doing this now for 35 years, so I've seen a lot of cases.
How many child sexual abuse exams do you believe you've conducted?
Hundreds. Maybe it's 500. It might be a little less or a little more. I'm not sure.
And are you
but a lot of them. And then that's me personally. And then we do peer review. every month. And so what we're doing is we're looking at all the cases that other people have done as well. So there's an administrative component or a review component of looking at other people's exams as well.
And are you still currently doing them to date?
Yes,
When you serve as on-call?
I do.
Have you published any writings or articles in the area of child abuse, physical or sexual?
I have, I think 60 or more, something like that, and another 60 or more. I'm sorry, I just haven't done a recent count on it. Books or chapters.
I have your CV here from last published May of 2019, and it being over 40 pages. So do you update that regularly with regards to articles that you, or chapter books that you publish or edit?
I do. Well, I do, actually. My secretary does, but yes, we both do.
Included in there, do you update presentations that you may do in the area of child abuse and sexual abuse?
I do.
Do you present only within the state of Florida and those that you work with regards to child abuse and sexual abuse?
No. I presented all over the country and most of the states. I've presented to the military, a number of different countries, in Australia and Scotland and Saudi Arabia about 10 times, Kuwait 3 times, maybe a dozen times in Estonia. Just a variety of other places.
And on
New Zealand, Korea, China, a variety of places.
And are these on various topics of physical child abuse and or sexual child abuse?
Well, at least those. I mean, it could be something else that's related to another form of child abuse as well.
When you worked for the Morehouse School of Medicine, was that for the Center of Child Abuse?
Right, I was the director.
And most recently, in 2009, did you have an occasion to be an editor of a book that specifically dealt with child sexual abuse?
2019.
I'm sorry, did I say 2009?
You said 2009, I think.
I meant 2019.
Yeah, we just put out a book. I enlisted another person to help me, and we just put out a book on child sexual abuse, which is kind of probably the latest book that there is on that.
Can you give us a brief description of what kind of material is entailed within that?
Well, a variety of things. It's about epidemiology. It's about how to do exams. It's what exam findings look like. What are some of the latest criteria? And as editor, I get a bunch of people to write chapters of various sorts. I wrote several of the chapters about team functioning, some stuff about neurobiology of what happens in these cases, in terms of how it affects people, in terms of the genetics and epigenetics and a variety of other brain changes and other things. One of the best chapters that I like a lot is we had our person from FDLE who does the laboratory stuff for DNA and everything else. She wrote a terrific chapter on what are all the latest things on DNA and what you can do and not do and everything. So at least in 2019, it's probably the latest book. And my bias, of course, is I think it's the best book, but I guess the readers will decide.
Have you testified previously in court regarding your work in the area of child abuse?
Yeah, a variety of different forms, sure.
And how many times?
In court? Oh, I've been in court over 500 times.
Have you testified outside of the state of Florida?
Yeah, I mean, it started out, I spent 20 years before I came to Florida, so I had a lot of experience in those other states, but I've testified in 30 states and several countries.
Judge, at this time I'd ask if the defense has any questions in this limited area.
No, Your Honor.
Dr. Alexander, were you asked to consult on a case involving 9-year-old victim by the name of Felicia Williams?
I was.
When is it that you were asked to consult on this case?
Well, I was asked to consult on basically genital findings. I know there were other things going on in the case. That was not what I was asked to review, but the question was really about what, if anything, is going on with genital findings.
And were you contacted back in May of 2014 by the state attorney's office?
I think it was then, yes.
And as part of your job with the University of Florida, do you consult on cases?
Right. I consult with cases, again, around the country or even some other countries occasionally, and certainly within Florida.
You had previously mentioned that you were asked specifically to review and give an opinion, if you could, with regards to the genital injuries. Were you asked to do anything with regards to looking at the neck injuries in this case, or the cause of death?
I wasn't. I do that reasonably often, but not in this case. I was not asked to do that, and I didn't do that.
What were you provided to review in this case?
Well, a lot of materials. I got a couple of CDs, and they showed pictures of the scene. And there was one sequence that just showed the plants along a roadway. There were a bunch of various police logs of things, and I don't recall them specifically. It might have been like telephone logs or some other sorts of investigative sorts of things. The areas that I focused particularly on were some scene photographs, autopsy photographs, and various close-ups that came from the autopsy. That was really the focus of what I was being asked about.
Were those the most beneficial for you to review in order to give an opinion in this case?
For that question, sure. Yeah, the other things were related to other investigation details, but that wasn't my focus.
You've performed numerous child abuse, physical, sexual abuse examinations. Is it fair to say that the majority of those exams are on children that are still alive?
Yes.
Have you performed sexual abuse examinations, child abuse examinations on children that were in fact deceased?
I'm not sure if I have. I just can't remember. There's one case that was kind of, whether I was looking for that or not. I think I did look at a kid once that was dead, and we were looking at some issues. But the majority of things is I've had a number of things where I've had photographs and case review of dead children that I was making opinions about. And I may have had 10 to 20 of those cases in my career. And then the rest of them, they're living.
And so you also, as you stated earlier, do the death fatality review. Is that correct?
Yes.
Of the children. So I assume that those patients are deceased.
Yes, they are.
And the majority of your patients that you do actually conduct exams on are coming to you via, as we discussed, through maybe the Department of Children and Family or law enforcement who is bringing this actual live child to you to conduct this examination.
Right. We get them through DCF if it's a caregiver situation. So if there's a concern that a caregiver was neglectful or was the perpetrator, DCF would maybe bring them in. And sometimes with law enforcement, sometimes not. But when I'm on call and it's the middle of the night, it's most likely a teenager, and it's mostly likely not a caregiver. And so law enforcement brings them in, and we probably won't see DCF.
When you are reviewing these cases for your child fatality death review, when you have to do your reports, are you reviewing such things as autopsy reports, autopsy photographs?
Yeah, pretty much all the time. I just had a case that I reviewed yesterday that didn't have an autopsy because it was an older child and we knew the cause of death, and so they didn't do an autopsy. That wasn't the issue. But I would say that's pretty uncommon. Most all the time there's an autopsy.
And then you render opinion or write a report with regards to your review of that?
I do. We use that report in our review when we get everybody around the table and we do our child death reviews, which happens throughout the state. But in each of our areas we do it. So when I'm on that team and we're reviewing the cases, we look at what everybody around the table has to say, law enforcement, DCF, maybe someone from the school system or public health or a variety of other places. And then we also look at my report as well, medical examiners there. We try to put it all together and figure out what's going on.
Doctor, I'm going to show you what's already been introduced into evidence as State's Exhibit KB 31. And if you can look at the screen behind you. Is this one of the photographs that you were provided to review in order to come to your ultimate opinion?
It looks like it, yes.
Can you orient us as far as the female genitalia and tell us the different parts that make up a female genitalia?
Sure. Can I stand
And
and
if
point?
standing at, yes, Judge, may he stand if that assists him in explaining the female genitalia?
Am I in your way?
You're fine.
All right, so this is a close-up view of what we would see. This is kind of like my exam would be often on living kids. And first thing we'd notice would see is there any sign of hair suggesting there was some sort of puberty, in this case real early puberty sort of stuff. And then what's not as easy to tell is there's a little bit of an estrogen effect, meaning early puberty again. This is not a 3-year-old type of look that you'd have pre-puberty. It's not somebody who's fully mature either. So that's the starting point. Out here, sort of stretched out here, this is just pulled sort of sideways, are the labia majora, okay, the outer lips. And then what we're looking at when we get in here, it's not so distinct in this photograph, but we're going to be looking for labia minora. The clitoris is up in here. Urethra, where you pee out of, is in there. And usually that's all closed up, so you don't see a hole. And then what we're looking at here, those dark areas that you see right in there, that's actually looking into the vagina. Vagina, by definition, is deeper than the hymen. The hymen's at the entrance of the vagina, which goes deeper inside. And then we're looking here, so this is vagina, and that's vaginal tissue. We're looking right along the edges here, labia minora out here, and we're looking at hymen, it's right in there. This is, just in terms of terminology, where the labia sort of come together here and here, and then the part of your body that's between your anus and all of this genital structure, where that sort of trisects, is called the posterior fourchette. Fourchette is French for fork, I think. And the fork is sort of here with its two things sticking out here. And that spot, which is very distinct here, somewhere here, that is the posterior fourchette. That's external. Between there and back to the hymen and the vagina, there's like a little valley. And in medicine, we call that a fossa. And it's the fossa navicularis. Navicularis is like natividad is, birth, that sort of notion. And so there's this little valley there. And that's basically the anatomy.
Thank you, Doctor. When you viewed this photograph, did you have an opinion as to whether or not those white areas located on this photograph were injury or whether they were artifact?
Well, they're most suspicious for injury, but that's my first initial impression. But my other impression is I want to see more pictures. Because just this one picture alone, I kind of want to see, is this something else? It doesn't look like light reflection. Occasionally we get it if something's real wet, you get light reflection back. That doesn't look like this, so I didn't think it was that artifact.
Did you receive numerous photographs in this case to review?
Numerous autopsy photographs. There were just 4 or 5 that really pertained, I think, to the genital area more directly.
We're going to move a little closer on State's Exhibit KB 32. Can you explain what we're seeing here and where you find injury?
Sure. So In this particular one, then, it's a little better view of what we saw before, but it's not a different view. So you asked about artifact, but it keeps showing up. So in this particular case, we're seeing two areas of abnormalities. This whitish area that's out here, it's on the child's mid to left side, our right side as we look at it. And then there's a whitish area that is higher up as we look at the picture. Just for reference, this is Hymen, and it's this distance here to here. There's normally a vaginal opening, because if there wasn't, that's an abnormality. Fluid would build up and eventually have become a medical problem. You have to have an opening for things to get out. And so this is all normal looking here, normal rim of Hymen. The abnormality is right here, which is there's no Hymen here from the 5 to 7 o'clock position. We look at this as a clock face, 12 o'clock up here, 6 o'clock here, and from 5 to 7 there is no Hymen. The defect here is what I call laceration. In other words, a kind of a rip, not a cut like you do with a scalpel, but a rip, and it extends right up from this fossa here, and it goes right through the hymen and just a tiny bit into the vagina. And then this is another injury that's a little farther out.
So, if I heard you correctly, there are 3 separate and distinct injuries within the genitalia that you just described.
Well, or you could say that this one that's out here is that's more inner in the fossa, extends into right through the hymen and into the vagina a little bit.
So, if we could talk about the 5 to 7 o'clock hymen missing, is that considered an injury?
Yes.
Okay. That is abnormal in this 9-year-old's genitalia. Is that correct?
It would be abnormal in anybody's genitalia.
Okay. When you're looking at the injury that is closest, and I'm sorry, you can have a seat, doctor. Closest to the hymen, the missing hymen area from 5 to 7, how far or deep in does that injury go into the genitalia?
It varies a little bit from child to child, even at this age, to say. But if you start at sort of the outer lips, depending how puffy they are and everything else, you're probably at least half an inch in or so. It could vary some, though. So, but it's that concept that it's interior. It's an interior structure that's supported by ligaments. It's not, at least particularly in this area, there's no bone underneath it.
And if I can show you State's Exhibit KA1, which is an even closer view of what we were just discussing. Does this photograph depict the injury that is going through the hymen area, that it is going through and into the vaginal area?
It does. It's basically showing the same things that we saw before. The one you were pointing at, it starts in that fossa area, which is a little hard to see the three-dimensionality of it. If you're not used to looking at this, you wouldn't necessarily see it as necessarily three-dimensional, but it actually is. And it extends there, and then it's going up through the hymen. You see the hymen's disrupted, and it's a little past the hymen. And, of course, if the hymen's disrupted, kind of by definition, it's into the vagina.
And this other injury, which is below it, this is a separate laceration or rip that you discussed earlier from the one above it. Is that correct?
Or abrasion, or something, yeah, something that took off some of the, what we call the mucosal surface.
What is, or how can these rips or lacerations be caused?
A blunt force penetrating injury. First of all, it's getting inside to get to that point. We call it blunt force because this is a ripping of tissue. It's not like a knife with a clean cut or something else like that. And this is something that actually we, as far as this location, in the fossa and up in there. That's something that we often see with blunt force penetrating injuries. Various objects could do it, but they can't be objects that are particularly cutting objects. It's dildos, penises, they can do it. I wouldn't expect a finger to do that because it's you need to get something a little wider.
If it was multiple fingers, could it have caused that?
Maybe. I've never seen that. But again, all you have to do is get something wide enough.
Are these injuries consistent with having been inflicted?
Yes.
When you looked at these photographs and observed the injury, did you have an opinion, and I'm showing KB 31 now, with regards to this injuries actually being injuries and not artifact that were found all along the front part of her body?
I did have an opinion.
And what was that?
That I didn't think it was the same thing. I thought that this was not the artifact of washing up against rocks. It would take some sort of a penetrating object that's smooth enough and then penetrating enough, and not just to penetrate, but penetrate enough and in action enough to rip things to do that.
And it would have to be so penetrating to hit simply just this area and none of this area surrounding her genitalia. Is that correct?
That's right. So, for instance, we see straddle injuries on a fairly regular basis. Kids that, well, we see them in boys too, but we see them in girls. You know, you always think of handlebars on bikes, but there's a lot of toys and kids will land on everything else. They get bruising along the top of this photograph where there's bone, but farther down there isn't bone. So we see bruising to the labia, occasionally to labia majora, occasionally the labia minora, but not this injury that's an injury that's driven up into the vagina.
Typically with straddle injuries, do you see it up above around the 9 to 3 o'clock area?
Yeah, the upper half of that dial.
Not where we have injury here.
Right, but we also don't, it would be rare to ever see a hymen injury. I've seen a bruise to a hymen where it was not just the hymen, but it was also the labia minora and labia majora, where it's bruising because they really straddled to hit something. But typically we don't see the hymen even bruised. And this is the laceration.
This kind of injury, if it was on a young child, is this an injury that they would exhibit pain or say that they were in pain?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it hurts. First of all, the injury hurts. And then the second thing is as soon as you pee, that's urine, usually acidic, going right onto an open wound. And it really hurts.
The fact, did you find any bruising or contusion inside past where this most inner injury is? Did you find any bruising such as that?
Well, I didn't see any, but this was all I had as I had the photograph. So if there was something more interior, that would be a dissection, and I'd have to leave it to the pathologist if they did such a thing.
Okay.
I don't think that anybody reported that to me.
Is this injury consistent with being a non-accidental injury?
Right. I mean, this is pretty typical for one of the ways in which we see sexual abuse.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not, or when this injury could have been inflicted with regards to how old it is?
I do. The genital area heals really fast. It's sort of like the inside of your mouth when you get a cut or you bite your lips or tongue. It heals pretty quickly, quicker than, say, your outside skin does. And so we see kids around the United States, often within 72 hours of the time they have an injury. Partly for DNA reasons, but even before DNA, we would see them because things heal, and if we wait too long, we won't see it. It'll heal itself. So when I see an injury here, and it doesn't look like it's pretty close to healed up, it makes me feel like it's within 0 to 3 days or so. can't be that precise about it. I'm not trying to be super precise, but if we waited 5 days, that should be pretty healed up.
And again, you said that that's going to hurt when someone urinates.
Oh yeah.
Is it going to hurt when they wipe themselves?
Yes.
And do children who are sexually assaulted or report that they're sexually assaulted, do you typically find injuries such as these?
Typically, we don't find anything. In prepubertal kids, about 95% of the time, we don't find any injury at all. So finding injury is actually somewhat uncommon. With the teenagers who come in with acute sexual assaults, we find a higher frequency of injuries because it's an acute sexual assault. With our little kids, they usually say 3 months ago somebody did something to me, and it's all healed up, and we're not going to find anything.
As your job examining children, specifically for sexual assault, do you also have the occasion to take swabbings of the genitalia?
Yeah.
And can you describe how you go about doing that?
Well, we talk nicely to the children because, tell them what we're doing and everything else. It usually works great. Kids are great patients, teenagers. We just tell them we have this little Q-tip. We're going to touch them with it. If they're not estrogenized, we just swab more on the outside because the hymen is really sensitive, and if you touch it, they might scream and hit the ceiling or something. So you have to be really careful in that. And most people won't do that. We won't touch the hymen or try to get any farther.
Typically,
as
what
long as
age
they're awake.
is the hymen sensitive, such as that?
Pardon?
Typically, what age? Until what age does that
It's whether
change?
you're estrogenized or not.
So what does that mean?
So once you start puberty, the hymen changes, so it's a little less sensitive. And from a reproductive point of view, you can't have this hymen so super sensitive that nobody has sex, the species dies out because nobody's making babies. So what happens is the body starts to change, so it's receptive to the notion that, yes, you can have sex, it's not going to be really particularly painful, and you can have babies and go on with that. But before you start that, it would be pretty sensitive. It's pretty sensitive tissues there. So when we have somebody here that started this, they're okay with swabs. We can put swabs in and Q-tips, and we go in real slowly and take a couple swabs. Usually we do 2 evidence swabs, and then we do 1 swab that's for culture.
And has the victim in this case, is she fully estrogenized?
No, she's on her way.
Okay. And so you take these swabbings, and what's the purpose of taking these swabbings?
Well, one of them is we want to know if they have disease. So that's one of our medical things is we want to know if there's any gonorrhea, chlamydia, other concerns. And then typically in our clinic we'd have you come back 2 weeks later and we get some syphilis testing and we do some other follow-ups, some AIDS testing, HIV testing. But the other reason is we get a couple of swabs that we send to FDLE for evidence.
When your patients come in and you are determining whether or not you're going to do swabbing, such as you just discussed, do you go through asking them very detailed questions? Have you gone to the bathroom? Have you wiped? Have you taken a shower? Do you ask them things such as that? Maybe approach runner?
No, go ahead.
You can
Yeah,
answer.
we do. We ask all those questions.
Why do you
And more.
ask those kinds of questions?
We want to get some sort of sense of if there's anything that's compromised our potential yield. It doesn't mean we won't still do it, but it's possible if you've done a lot of washing that we might not pick up, say, DNA as much.
Can water affect your ability to retrieve evidence for further testing?
Sure.
Whether or not someone used a condom, can that affect your ability to retrieve evidence?
Sure.
Judge, may I have a moment?
Yes.
Dr. Alexander, within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, are these injuries consistent with blunt force trauma or a penetrating object into the vagina.
Yes.
Within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, are these injuries consisted with inflicted and non-accidental trauma?
Yes.
Within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, are these injuries consistent with sexual abuse?
Yes. We see injuries like this periodically from sexual abuse.
No further questions, Judge?
Cross?
No questions, thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, may this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. You're free to go.
Thank you.
Back to the theater.
Thank you.
All right, State, we have another witness this afternoon.
Your Honor, I think that was it for this afternoon. That's it.
Okay. Okay, so I know it's been a long day today, so we're going to go ahead and break early. And I believe the state, you believe you will rest sometime tomorrow, correct? Hopefully, maybe.
Maybe.
Okay, all right, never mind. I will try, and we'll see how things go, but we will break a little early tomorrow as well. It's been a long 2 weeks, and I'm aware of that, so just so you all know, I will give you a break tomorrow as well, since it is Friday and it's the end of the week, all right? So, you know what I'm going to tell you. Tonight when you go home, don't talk about this case with anybody. Don't do any independent research about this case. Don't listen to, watch, or read any news accounts related to this case. And we'll be back at it tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. All right? We'll see you then.
All rise, jury exiting.